So this is the lecture for part 7 in the Kamian textbook, which is non-Western music. Part 7 is 3 chapters. The first chapter, which is what I'm going to cover today, is basic elements of non-Western music. Certain characteristics that we find in this huge diversity of music that we characterize as non-Western. So, for starters, well, what do we mean by non-Western? Anytime we talk about Western music, just like Western art, Western culture, we're talking about music that, for the most part, originated in Europe and then migrated to the Americas. So when we're talking about Western music, the entire canon of classical music we think of, for the most part, as being Western music, starting, over in Germany, France, Italy, England, Spain, and then that influence felt in America in the 19th and 20th centuries. But there's a huge diversity of music, an amazing diversity of music you found all around the world, because there's an amazing diversity of cultures that you will find all around the world. They all have music in common, but the way they make music and the significance of music in their cultures can vary significantly. So each culture has its own specific instruments, has its own specific performance practices, that is to say, the way that they choose to make music. Tonal systems, so we've talked about, when we're talking about fundamentals of music, when we're talking about harmony, we're talking about melody, we're talking about scales, and the concept of major and minor are tonal systems. Other cultures have completely, radically different tonal systems, different melodies, and different concepts of rhythmic patterns. So, to kind of make it easier to classify music, ethnomusicologists, there's a term I'm going to bandy about during this particular part of the book. An ethnomusicologist is someone who studies music of a group of people. It can be music from a specific country, it can be music of a specific religion, it can be music from a specific area of a country, or music of a specific tribe. But ethnomusicology is really, in the last 100 to 120 years, become quite an interesting academic pursuit and been incredibly influential in musical circles. So, ethnomusicologists have classified as 3 basic kinds of music. Pretty much every kind of music, every piece of music ever written, every song, can be classified as one of these 3 things, and some of them can be classified as more than one. So first, folk music, also known as traditional music. Folk music is music that represents a group of people, tells the story of their history and the story of their culture. Folk music has been around, probably the earliest music we classify as being folk music, and there is an incredible diversity of folk music around the world. Pop music, or popular music, that's music whose primary function is to entertain. It's not necessarily there to tell a story, or it's not necessarily there to transmit information. Folk and traditional music is actually one way that people use to transmit the history of their religion or the history of their people before the written word. Popular music is intended to entertain solely. Classical music is music that is more formal in both the way it's created and in the way it's performed, whereas popular music you will find in many, many different areas, as I said, just to entertain. Classical music is more of a focal point where when people are going to witness a classical concert, be it Western or non-Western classical music, the concert is usually a little more formal in the way that the audience behaves, in the way the music is produced. Now, many kinds of music over the years have kind of bent these genres. There's classical music that has incorporated pop elements. There's popular music that has become folk music. I mean, some music that we think of today as being folk music started out as popular music in its day. Even songs from the 1800s like Camptown Races, well, that was popular music of the time, and it's kind of worked its way into the folk canon now. 100 years from now, 200 years from now, certain songs that were written as popular music may well become folk music, be thought of as folk music. So, while these genres, you can classify music in any of these genres, some music can bend across the genres, if you will. Generally speaking, though, we're going to look at certain characteristics of all non-Western music. Much non-Western music is linked with dance, linked with drama, or linked with religious ceremonies. And you can say the same thing about a lot of Western music as well, I suppose. When we're talking about folk music, it was many times used to communicate messages or to relate traditions, to tell the story of a group of people. And much of this music is transmitted by oral tradition. In other words, you know, we spent all that time in part 1 of the book talking about music notation. Well, the opposite of reading music from notation is transmitted through oral tradition. In other words, the elders in the group of people teach the young people what the music is. This is how you sing it. These are the words, this is the melody, and you repeat it. You learn it by repetition and by rote. As we've talked about in class, one of the weaknesses of oral tradition, of course, is that mistakes can be made, or people can change things based on their own personal biases. And then the other danger, of course, is always that somebody's going to die before they can transmit all the information. However, in cultures that don't have music notation, oral tradition is the only way to transmit music. In other cultures, have music notation, but they actually only use it as a way to put down the music for posterity, you know, to put down the music to save it, but it's still taught through oral tradition. Some incredibly complicated music is taught by rote throughout the world. Many cultures stress improvisation in their music. We've talked about this. Improvisation is when you are spontaneously creating the music from the word go, instead of reading something that's already pre-written down. Having said that, many of these improvisations are very strictly structured. Indian classical music that we're going to spend a little time looking at in class is improvised, but these improvisations are rooted very strictly in traditions, in melodic and rhythmic patterns that have been around for 3,000 years. In this music, you literally have to study for years before you're allowed to perform in public. It is very complex. It's a very complex system. So you are improvising, but you're actually boxed in by some very strict rules in certain traditions. The main way of making music historically has always been singing. Singing, as I've said, is probably the most natural, fundamental way to make music. The first music ever made was most likely sung. However, the way you sing varies radically from culture to culture. What is acceptable in one culture, what is preferred in one culture, may be unacceptable or considered to be in bad taste or just to be bad in another culture. For example, in the Middle East, what we might characterize in Western music as being nasally sounded, in other words, kind of here in the nose, or having a strained quality of voice, in certain styles of Western music is actually the way that you sing classical music in the Middle East. In Siberia and Tibet, there's actually a thing called throat singing, where you can actually sing more than one note at a time. I will play a video of this for you in class, because it's really quite remarkable. Of course, if you did that in certain other styles of music, people would go crazy, because it would be nuts. So, when we're not singing, or in conjunction with singing, of course, we're utilizing instruments in all of this music around the world. There are literally tens of thousands of instruments. If you were to count up every instrument from every culture that's existed over the last even just 3,000 years, you will find tens of thousands of instruments. Some of them have gone obsolete and been replaced by other instruments. Some of them are still played in the traditional way that they've been played for hundreds and even thousands of years. So, in order to categorize all of these instruments, because there are instruments, every culture, more or less, has a stringed instrument that you pluck, kind of like a guitar or a banjo. But they're all slightly different, and they have different names. So, to categorize these instruments, ethnomusicologists have come up with 4 different categories. Chordophones, where the thing that makes the sound is a stretched string. An example of a chordophone is a guitar or a banjo. Another example of a chordophone, however, is a piano. Because while you're not actually plucking the string of the piano, it's being struck by a hammer when you press keys down, the thing that's making the sound is a stretched string vibrating, so that's a chordophone. Aerophone An aerophone is any instrument where the sound is made by blowing into it with the performer's breath. Of course, in Western music, there are many common aerophones, things like trumpets and saxophones and clarinets, but there are aerophones all around the world. I'm going to bring into class, I'll bring my didgeridoo that I own. A didgeridoo is an Australian Aboriginal aerophone that is played by blowing into it. Membranophones, a membranophone is any instrument where the vibration is caused by a skin that is stretched on some kind of frame, usually wooden frame. Most drums, no matter what culture you're in, the vast majority of drums are considered to be membranophones. And finally, idiophones. An idiophone is where the sound generator is the entire body of the instrument. The entire instrument is struck and set into vibration. The most common idiophones are things like gongs and bells. So, every one of these tens of thousands of instruments can fit into one of these categories. So why do different cultures select different kinds of instruments? Well, for a few reasons. Geography and the materials available. For example, idiophones, gongs, bells, cymbals, things like that, have been around in Southeast Asia for thousands of years. The process of refining ore and casting metal started in Southeast Asia. So those instruments, due to the proximity of the materials and the techniques developed, idiophones became more popular, metal ones, in Southeast Asia and have been around much longer than they have in many other parts of the world. Religion can also influence instrumentation, even if we're just talking about Western music, for example. If you go back to the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages, instruments were actually banned from church because they were thought to distract people from the message, which was the words, and instruments, of course, can't convey words. And there was also concern that instruments would evoke certain pagan practices like dancing. So religion has a strong influence on not only what instruments are chosen, but also tradition can be a very, very strong thing indeed. And so religious traditions have kept certain instruments in use for hundreds and even thousands of years. It's a picture of a didgeridoo. Like I said, I'm going to bring my didge into class. Melody, rhythm, and texture. Now, much music that you're going to hear around the world is monophonic, especially things that are sung unaccompanied. Sometimes, as we'll see in Indian music, it's monophonic, but it is accompanied by a drone that is a single sustained pitch, which to some degree makes it homophonic, because technically it's more than one line of music, although the second line of music isn't really doing anything, it's just sustaining one pitch. Some traditions, very specifically the music of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is incredibly complicated. It's very polyphonic, involving a lot of different rhythms going on at one time. So it's not only polyphonic, it's polyrhythmic. Also, a variety of scales. We talked about in the West, we have major and minor scales. In other cultures, you find very different scales. You find some pentascales, that is to say scales that are only 5 notes. You find some 6-note scales, 7-note scales, and even microtones, where if the smallest note that makes up any Western music is a semitone, or a half step, in other words, the distance between 2 keys on a piano, some cultures utilize microtones, that is to say, intervals that are even smaller than this half step. And then, as I said, some of the rhythms that you'll find in certain music are incredibly complex and can take years to master. Again, frequently taught through oral tradition. So, non-Western music, traditional or folk music, classical music, and even to a lesser degree popular music has been around for hundreds and even in some cases thousands of years. But it's been, like everything else, it's been strongly influenced by technology. Increased urbanization, for example. Countries that were much more agrarian have become much more urban in the last century. That has a large influence, of course. The spread of technology. Well, the spread of technology not only to some degree has influenced the way that music is made through the instruments, but also access to recorded music, radio, and film. I've said this in class before. Musical genres and styles have become compressed over years. Whereas 1,000 years ago, it might take a few hundred years for all of the music of one style to evolve and eventually give rise to another style. Technology today has made it possible for styles to be created and be disseminated and become worldwide in a matter of, literally in a matter of weeks, and then just as quickly go out of style. This has had an effect on non-Western music, especially folk and traditional music. As music from all around the world becomes more prevalent, it of course becomes very influential. And sometimes that's a very good thing. Popular music, which has influences from music from Latin America, Central and South America, the Caribbean, popular music that has influences from Africa or from Southeast Asia, but it can also have an effect on this traditional music. And so some governments actually fund, they provide funds for people who will keep traditional culture alive. They actually pay groups to keep traditional music, traditional dance, and other traditional arts alive, because quite frankly, there's no money to be made in doing that, and so the governments pay for it just to make sure that it stays alive. All right, so this is more or less where we're going to stop this portion of the lecture. I'm going to pick up in class with Chapter 2, which is music in sub-Saharan Africa. Chapter 3 is music in India, and we'll also look a little bit at music of Japan.